Defender of the Crown is a strategy game developed by Cinemaware set in medieval Britain. The basic premise is that multiple factions are vying for power following the death of the king. As the player, your aim is to build up your armies to acquire territory and ultimately to dominate the map. In addition to the overworld map, the game also features jousting competitions and castle invasions. Another gameplay element that exists in some of the ports is the ability to use catapults against an opponent's castle defenses. In effect, Defender of the Crown is essentially a series of mini-games that are united by a broader narrative. Unlike many of the games I discuss on this channel, Defender of the Crown is not a game I played upon its initial release, or indeed even in the many years that have followed. So, in order to offer a review, I've enlisted some help from Wayne. He's the guy who composes the music for Once and Future Tech. I asked him to discuss his memories of the game nearer to its original release, and to offer his thoughts after returning to it all of these years later. It's worth noting that Wayne is playing a copy of the game that is available on GOG.com, which includes the Amiga and DOS versions. Much of the footage that follows is from the Amiga version, but I'll briefly show some of the ports near to the end of the video. In any case, let's hear what Wayne has to say about Defender of the Crown.
I first came across Defender of the Crown at a friend's house, and believe it was a Commodore Amiga 500 that I first saw it on. I was a rubber-keyed 48K Spectrum user at the time, and this particular friend was the only one in my immediate circle who had a C64 and then subsequently upgraded to an Amiga. I was, of course, a staunch Spectrum loyalist, but, like anyone with eyes and ears, still secretly a little envious of those with a C64, let alone what the Amiga was capable of. I can actually still remember being properly awed by the graphics and music of the game's opening sequence, and thinking of how much it was like something I could see on the TV. The graphic version of England and Wales map was particularly special to behold, with its animated water and its relief mountains, castles and forests. It really was very much all about the visuals. All my golden glow recollections of the game revolve around how rich the graphical experience was, rather than anything about the gameplay. The platform I seriously played Defender of the Crown on was the Commodore Amiga 500. In fact, it was the emergence of games like Defender of the Crown, at least as I recall from that time, that really signalled the end of the 8-bit reign in my young mind. My parents bought me the Amiga in the mid-80s, I suspect after much pleading and begging on my part as a result of being exposed to my friend's Amiga. Defender of the Crown was one of the first games I had for it. Playing it by myself was significant, as up until owning the Amiga, I'd only really watched the game played. I finally got to be the sword-wielding hero of my own cinematic story. The main objective of the game is to become lord over all the main shires of England and Wales, beginning your endeavours in the year 1149. Within the game, the country is divided into 18 of these territories, for which you have to vie with 5 other computer-controlled lords for overall supremacy. The actual gameplay itself is a turn-based strategy, with basic resource management thrown into the mix. Every territory you own generates income from taxes, and each turn you can use this income to buy soldiers, knights, catapults and castles. With soldiers and knights you can garrison your castles and build your campaign army, and with a campaign army you can seek the conquest of new territories. Each turn lasts a month in game time, during which you can move around your own territories and do as much resource management as you like. When you move your campaign army into a territory you don't own, your turn ends. The computer will then take turns for all the non-player characters. There are a couple of other ways you can use your turn. You can go raiding for gold, which involves fighting your way into an enemy's castle, with a view to stealing from their treasury, or you can hold a tournament. At a tournament you can joust for territory, or just for fame. From a control perspective, raiding and laying siege to a castle requires some real-time interaction. That's essentially it for the core game mechanics, though to be fair, that's not quite the whole story, as you do randomly get the opportunity to rescue a princess. In gameplay terms, this is like raiding. Other factors can also impact your endeavours, such as Norman rogues sabotaging your catapults or stealing your taxes. Very annoyingly, I might add. You need to have purchased a catapult to take an enemy castle, and your territories generate a small number of soldiers on their own each month. You can also call on Robin Hood to aid you in a siege or when raiding 3 times during a game by visiting Sherwood. Playing the GOG release of Defender of the Crown 30 years later is an interesting experience. The GOG release packages up both the Amiga and PC versions for you to run on a modern PC, and the Amiga version plays exactly as I remember it. Graphically, despite the, at least by modern standards, limited colour palette and resolution, it still holds up surprisingly well, and certainly, for me, creates the atmosphere I still remember fondly. I'm sure nostalgia has a part to play in this though. I'd also forgotten just how unusual the music was, particularly in terms of its feel from a timing point of view, though it certainly works well for the era in which it's set. Creating the arrangement of the raiding music for this podcast was actually a bit of an eye-opener. I found myself wondering whether Jim Cuomo, the original composer, had written the music for more traditional instruments, and if so, what they may have been. It was a fascinating exercise deciding what toms to use based on listening to the original Sid chip music. Sadly, the gameplay was ultimately as I remembered it to be. Very simple and repetitive. The real-time activities, in particular jousting and sword fighting, are actually frustrating rather than fun, which is actually how I remembered them to be. The conquest aspect of the game also relied far too much on chance than strategy, and always felt unbalanced to me. Often one computer-controlled player would rapidly become so powerful as to be undefeatable, or you would become so powerful as to easily win. Resolving battles was similarly too simply implemented, and as a consequence, you never feel completely in control. The suspension of disbelief in terms of its milieu is still there though, thanks to its rich visuals. In terms of games similar to Defender of the Crown, I can't actually think of any contemporary to its original release that was similar enough to warrant real comparison. For me, the arrival of the point-and-click adventures such as Monkey Island were the closest to it, and this was due to their heavy reliance on richly illustrated scenes rather than their gameplay. In terms of turn-based strategy, I'm tempted to go further back to the Spectrum's seminal Lords of Midnight. The Lords of Midnight even now is still a wondrous thing. Despite its debatably more simple graphics, it manages to create a palpable world for you to inhabit, and a cast of characters that still resonate. It ties all this up in a gameplay that, while simple by modern standards, is still incredibly absorbing. Ultimately, for me, the chief criticism I would level at Defender of the Crown, and I would have also said this 30 years ago too, is its weak gameplay. There was so much more that could have been done in this area to make the gameplay as good as the presentation. I interestingly also find the cutscenes shown after rescuing a princess to be perhaps a little bit questionable when seen through my adult eyes. I was going to say mature eyes there, but decided that wouldn't have been entirely accurate. The portrayal of women in games has experienced a lot worse than Defender of the Crown, but this is still perhaps somewhat cringeworthy where modern sensibilities are concerned. Despite its flaws, however, for me, Defender of the Crown is still a landmark game.
So there we have it, Wayne's review and reminiscence of Defender of the Crown. It's a reminder that sometimes nostalgia plays a central role in our enjoyment of older titles. What it also reveals is that it is possible to look back and think critically about the presentation and narrative devices employed in games of this era that may not hold up as well today. Before concluding, here's a brief look at different versions of the game. I'll let you decide which one you think is best. As always, thanks for watching.